Okay, this is the first lecture in regional planning to do with transport. So we've got 3 weeks together to look at Hobart if you're an on-campus student or a region of your choice if you don't have access to Hobart. Okay, so this is the content that I'm going to cover both this week and the next couple of weeks in terms of what you'll need to know to do the assessment. This week I'll cover transport features, what is integrated transport, what is a mode share and what multimodal transport might look like. I'll also introduce you to sustainable transport and the principles that underline sustainable transport planning, what a good air quote strategic transport plan might look like, because you'll need some of this before you do the field trip. And then finally, have a look at the sort of data that underpins transport planning, or at least should underpin transport planning, but often isn't collected. Who are the main actors and stakeholders in transport planning? You might want to work in this area, so I'll have talk about a little bit about the kind of graduate employment opportunities that there are. And even if you don't plan on working in transport planning, how you can have your say and how you can be effective. You have seen a version of this content before in the earlier weeks on regional planning theory. So in terms of transport, the practice is much like many other sectors of planning. Councils and the state government are open in terms of stakeholder input. Councils have advisory committees. I'm on one of the Hobart City Council committees around transport planning. And like any other aspect of planning, there's a public comment period for strategies and plans where you can have your say, and there's also the statutory planning avenue where if there's a formal application for development to council, you can have your say. In terms of participation and dialogue across different stakeholders, obviously the government enterprises that actually run transport in Hobart are pretty important. So bus companies, industry have a huge voice. Property Council of Tasmania, particularly with respect to land development and the kind of drivers of transport. NGOs, I'm sorry to say, don't have a huge voice. However, Heart Foundation has done some really good work on that background structure of good regional planning, good suburb planning, trying to get the ingredients in place that would drive a more sustainable and more active transport system. The current state of play in Tasmania is that government departments are not very well coordinated in terms of transport planning, and the connections between state and local government is also pretty patchy. It kind of depends, because some councils, Hobart probably has stronger relationships with state government than many of the other councils do, but it is quite patchy. And part of this is a resourcing issue. Department of State Growth was cut a lot when the Hodgman government came in as part of their promises around reducing the size of government, and that made a big difference in terms of their ability to actually deliver planning. Okay, so this is what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks. I'm going to talk about transport features, integrated transport, transport modes. Before we go on the field trip, you'll also need to review the material about sustainable transport planning, the principles that underlie sustainable transport planning, what a good, air quote, strategic transport plan might look like, so that when you're out doing your field work, either with me in Hobart or in your own region, you have an eye out for the kind of things that you need to discuss online. And then the final week is looking at the kinds of data that are needed for transport planning, who the main actors and stakeholders are, and what the avenues for being able to get involved in planning are in your region. Okay, so what is transport planning? Let's go back to the start. Much of this material is based on a chapter by Mies about transport planning, and it's in the regional planning book. I'll make that available in Milo. Transport really created cities, as Mies argues very early on in that chapter. So beginning with water transport, which favours locations close to harbours and rivers, transport really drove development. This then extended to railways. Once trains were up and running, railways really accelerated urban growth and meant that development wasn't so confined around ports. And this really changed the shape and the structure of cities. It meant that suburbs could spread over a much greater distance, particularly compared to old walking cities. Then cars came along and really opened things up again. And so no matter what area you look at, you'll see this common pattern from expansion from the ports, then along some sort of public transport line like the tram network in Hobart, and then a real opening up of the areas around that centre and around those linear corridors because of the freedom that the car brought. Many cities pretty blindly followed a car-dominated route, didn't have long-term planning, didn't, I guess, necessarily foresee that investment in cars as the primary means of transport might come back to bite them down the track. Mies talks about cities like Copenhagen, which is represented by the image here, Munich and Zurich, who adopted much more balanced transport plans in the 1960s than many places, certainly in Australia and North America. Essentially, this came about through substantial deliberate investment in public transport. So as well as catering for an increasing number of motorists, because the dominant mode share in these places is often still cars, even though we think of somewhere like Copenhagen as being paradise for people who want to get around without a car. There's still a lot of car use in these places. It's just that the mode share around public transport, around biking, around walking is much, much higher than other places. And this has been quite deliberately planned. So historically, most places did have much more of a balance. This is an image from somebody that I follow on Instagram who is one of the main transport planners in Copenhagen. Really beautiful old photograph of a mixture of transport in Copenhagen. Somebody could probably date the picture by the transport modes here, particularly the old car. But you can see the mix here of trams, cars, people on foot, and lots of people on bikes. And obviously the transport is all going slow enough that there's easy mixing of the different modes. So ironically enough, even though this might be seen as old-fashioned, a lot of places that are trying to shift towards a more sustainable transport environment are looking for this kind of low-speed shared zone as a means of changing from a car-dominated environment. This is really difficult, as Barry Hutton argues in his book, Planning Sustainable Transport. Anything that's that's seen as being anti-car or taking away from the freedom that cars are associated with now is a real political tripwire. And this is why it's been so difficult to shift from a car-dominated city for most places. This is Hobart around 1930, a kind of similar view, I guess, to what you saw in Copenhagen, which is probably taken around the same time. There were the trams that no longer exist in Hobart. Traffic tended to move fairly slowly. There weren't many cars. There were a lot of people on foot, a lot of people using bikes. The port was a very active place, as it is now, but a different kind of mix of uses in the port. So ironically enough, the current transport planning activity that's going on by the City of Hobart is looking to shift back to this earlier mode share, or more of a mix of a mode share than what we've got at the moment, because we've got to the point where car and congestion is becoming problematic, and cars are starting to mean that transport is becoming less reliable, and trips are taking longer. So this is the point where cars are seen to be breaking cities, is the way a lot of people have been putting it. But getting back from that situation is really difficult. People don't like having their freedoms curtailed, even though having that freedom might mean sitting in traffic. So a version of this diagram will appear in a lot of transport planning documents, particularly anything around sustainable transport planning. So this particular image is from Mies on page 635. So increased car ownership and car use has all these knock-on effects around healthy transport. So you see increased car use means a decline in walking, whether that's to the bus or to some other transport mode. And this is why the Heart Foundation has weighed in quite heavily around transport planning, because of the adverse health impacts. It means that changes in growth of retail centres, more retail areas outside the city that people can access by their car, lots of free public transport, huge big car parks around big box stores on the outskirts of cities. That has consequences in terms of the viability of existing retail centres. More demands for road and road parking. Roads are very expensive. This, of course, also has consequences in terms of the environment, pollution. It has road safety consequences. So the current road toll in Tasmania every year is about 340, 350 people. And this is a really unfortunate side effect of our car-dominated culture. And unfortunately, that toll has become socially normal. So it's very difficult to do anything about it now. Congestion, I've mentioned. This has adverse economic impacts. And just generally giving over space to cars means that we're choosing a certain kind of urban quality, urban space. When you allocate urban space to either moving traffic or storing private vehicles, like on streets for car parking, then you miss opportunities to make that space work differently. So there's a whole lot of ideas in this figure, and you'll see versions of this figure in basically any text on sustainable transport planning. So Hobart and Tasmania is very typical of most transport planning, in that it's very much dominated by engineers. It's become a very technical kind of discipline, and this is in concert with that comprehensive planning approach that you heard about in the first unit, where Michael talked about the different kind of planning approach. This is very much a data heavy, model heavy, technical heavy kind of discipline, where transport engineers and traffic engineers are generally the ones calling the shots. This makes things really difficult in terms of participatory planning, because you need to know a fair bit before you can feel like you're having much input. So much of traffic engineering goes back to standards set by Austroads. Austroads manuals are very technical about speeds and widths for various kind of components on the road, and it's not for the faint-hearted in terms of diving into some of that detail. So, which is not to say that we shouldn't have our say on what we think our regions should look like and how they should work for us. So it can be intimidating in terms of getting involved in transport planning, but everybody has a valid voice, even if you don't have that kind of engineering or architectural background that lets you have input on that same kind of technical platform. Okay, zoning. This is a key tool in terms of planning. The basic idea is to separate incompatible uses so you don't end up with light commercial right next to your home, but it can have unintended effects in terms of stymieing more creative development, mixed-use development, where you have residential and retail and a variety of different uses that might, under most planning schemes, have different zones. This can make it really difficult. So the other thing about zoning is that the relationship to transport is a bit chicken and egg. So do you bring in the transport changes first or land use changes? So this is relevant in Hobart around the discussion of light rail. So even though there's probably not the demand for light rail patronage at the moment, because we've got a traditional land use zoning system that has residences spread out and development spread out, do we put it in anyway and then use that transport corridor to concentrate development and create the demand? So this is really relevant in places like Victoria that have really opened up their development controls so that there's no incentive for developers to change their model other than opening up new land on the outskirts and more or less doing business as usual without providing services, and there's no transport. So there does need to be some planning, but it can be difficult to get the type of planning that you want, and it's a bit of a political tripwire for a politician to stick their neck out on something like this. So this is what a kind of traditional zone might look like. There's often a lot of different categories. This is for Ann Arbor, a city in the US, and this is what the current zoning looks like. So you've got areas that are concentrated general residential, you've got green areas, but basically the uses are more or less separated. So mixed-use zoning simplifies that, allows for greater diversity of different types of land use within the same area. So in this, the blue is still residential, but you're able to have some retail, some different kinds of use that's not heavy industrial, but it might be light industrial. And so the controls mean that you can have little hubs within the city that have a diversity of uses. The idea with transport is to provide the kind of mix of services so that you're not needing to travel and get in your car to go out to a box store, that you might be able to have areas close by. Ultimately, what you're trying to avoid is this kind of thing that's still very much the norm on, say, the outskirts of Melbourne, where you build highly car-dependent areas. There's no shops nearby, there's no retail. In some cases, for new suburbs, there might not be a school that's within easy walking or cycling distance. There's little to no public transport, and that doesn't come in until there's greater number of people living nearby and greater demand. So, this is where the chicken and egg comes in. Should planners allow this kind of development to take place, or should what has happened in Perth be much more normal, where ideas about transport-oriented development have held sway, and there has been a rail system built, and development has followed along from the rail system, and there's been infill along the rail system. But it's tricky and often politically contentious, especially when a government holds a free market approach. So under the type of zoning system that I've been involved in advocating, it has more of a mix at each site. So this is what it might look like, where you've got residential, but you've also got green space, community space, retail space, commercial space, all mixed in. Not necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but it's been the model in Europe for a long time, since the mid 1950s, 1960s, the sort of model that places like Copenhagen have embraced. Actually, the sort of model that the city of Canberra was built around, where you would have different hubs that had retail, and inner Canberra still is like this, where you don't have to get in your car and go to Belconnen to shop. So long as you're not wanting specialty goods, you can find them locally and you can walk or bike there. So that's the general idea of mixed-use zones. So this is just to remind me to say that not all movement is about people, it's also about freight. So especially when you're thinking holistically about sustainable transport, it's also about moving stuff. So in his book, Planning Sustainable Transport, Barry Hutton advocates for hubs that are serviced by larger vehicles and having increasingly smaller vehicles to run around the denser urban areas. So you're not having a big truck that's not necessarily carrying full capacity running into dense urban areas. The image I've got here shows a polycentric city. So zones A and E are both commercial, and so they've got both people and freight moving between them. Zones B and F are distribution centres, so this is where you might have your bigger vehicles coming in and dumping goods, offloading goods, and then having smaller vehicles access A and E, so little vans or some other less carbon intensive means of transport. G is meant to be an area of that's just residential, might be high density residential area, and so you get this as a major trip generator for people coming into A&E. So this is, and on the left is the spatial representation of these different relationships, where you've got the residential areas of C and D as well, that kind of general area, as well as the dense area of G in the middle of town, and all of the people movements and freight movements that this kind of system generates. So what transport planning and land use planning is all about is being deliberate in terms of designing this, and not just letting the free market do whatever's cheapest, which ends up with a lot of development out of town that is good for making money, but not necessarily at all the right direction in terms of a sustainable transport system. This is about zoning that doesn't necessarily have to be organised by function. So there are different ways of doing this. So on the left is the system that we're used to, where you've got commercial, administrative, general residential, industrial, light industrial, heavy industrial, green space. But you can also have zoning based on form. So you have a downtown area, you have a historical district, you have a manufacturing district. So you might get mixed development, but the kind of theme, the flavour of each area is still quite well defined and guides the kind of appropriateness of the development. The third one here is intensity zoning, so where you acknowledge that the middle of town is going to be dense living, dense activity, transport hubs, and then you work out from there. You might also have some areas that are green space that are no development. Incentive zoning is kind of what you get when you don't have any planning or have little control on planning. So I'm thinking about some of the critiques of what's happening in outer Melbourne at the moment, where it's maybe not so much rewards for developments, but there's so little control and there's ease of accessing agricultural land to be rezoned for residential that you get effectively an incentive to develop an area. So in terms of describing your transport features, here's how you might go about it. So I'm going to have a quick look at Sydney. So this is a shot of Circular Quay. This might be very familiar to some of you, and it shows what an important transport hub Circular Quay is, that you can get ferries and trains to this area, that there's reasonable biking and walking, and it's also a hub for tourism and commercial ships that come in. So Sydney is a bit challenging in terms of transport because of the harbour. So this creates bottlenecks around many of the key transport routes. So not just Sydney Harbour Bridge, but other places in the harbour. If you're trying to get to a central location or you're trying to travel across town, you tend to be funneled over bridges and other squeeze points. And it also limits the public transport network. So this image here shows the percentage of public transport in journeys to work, and you can see that most parts of inner Sydney are pretty well serviced. Some of these white gaps are where people don't live, so on the headland near Manly, but some of them reflect the fact that the trains just don't service these areas. So here's the next slide that shows the percentage of people who take the train to work in the morning, and you can see that there's quite large areas of inner Sydney that aren't serviced by trains. So it can be pretty difficult from some of these locations, particularly if you're not going into town but you're going across town. So I used to live at Bondi Beach and have to travel through Chatswood to get to Macquarie Park. This was before the train line went in. And basically, I had to use a car. I did sometimes catch a bus, but it was a really long bus trip with a change in the middle of town. And if I was going to do that every day, basically 4 hours of my day was spent on public transport. So I either had to work from home or had to figure out how to be productive on the bus because it took up a huge part of my day. Or I left early, I took the car and I was there pretty quickly. So Sydney has been a train city for quite a long time. So by the 1920s, Sydney already had a pretty good public transport system, care of trams and trains. The first rail services started in 1855, 67 years after the founding of Sydney, and the tram network began in 1861. So by the 1920s, it was already pretty large, and it meant that this rail infrastructure allowed people to live in the suburbs but work more centrally. So working class suburbs developed even quite a long way out of Sydney as early as the 1920s. So this kind of history underlies what you see in Sydney now. So in thinking about your region, you might need to delve back into what happened to understand the spatial distribution of suburbs and the pattern of transport that you see currently. In terms of mode share, this is another image from the MEES chapter, and it shows how much things have changed over a period of time between 1951 and 2006, and how the transport mode of workers, this is in Melbourne rather than Sydney, has changed. From some of these numbers have really massively changed. The total public transport has dropped from around 57% of workers to only 14%. Car use has jumped from 16% up to 78%. The non-motorised modes have dropped from 24% down to 5%. And in many parts of Melbourne, even 5% is a lot. It's more like 1 or 2%. So in thinking about your region, have a look to see what you can find about the historical mode share at various points of time. It doesn't have to be a particular time, but just in decades past, and see what you can find out about the mode share now or in kind of recent past. 2006 isn't very recent, but still the comparison and the change over this time is really interesting. So in terms of what I want you to do this week, I want you to describe the transport features of your region. So have a look at who are the regional organisations that look after transport planning. Is there more than one level of government that has something to say about transport planning in your area? What are your region's transport features? So what does your place look like? Where do people live? Where do people work? How do they get there? What's the current mode share? What can you find about current transport plans that are in place for your area? For those doing Hobart, we're going to need to subdivide this topic a little bit. Otherwise, it'll be a race to see who can post first. So you've got a choice. You can either pick a mode, say look at bikes as a means of getting around Hobart, what planning is there, what's already been built, what's been planned but not built, what's just not spoken about in terms of plans just missing. You could pick an area, say you live in Kingston, you might like to talk about the transport from Kingston. What are the attractors? Where are people going to? Where do people live? What choices have they got? Mention the different modes if you're taking this area approach. So talk about active transport, public transport and private car transport. Or you could ignore the people side of transport and look at freight instead if you like. So this needs to be posted to the Milo discussion board. The second online exercise is moving beyond this description and looking at the sustainable transport goals for your region. So what is there specifically about sustainable transport for your area? How might people get around? So what kind of options does somebody who has, say, lives in the outer areas, do they have options other than a car? How does this depend on where they live? What can you tell me from the theory that you're reading? And there'll be set readings for this week. And how does that apply to your region? So I am expecting this to be more than just a description based on your observations and your cruising around the internet. If you want to score well, then you're going to need to show me that you're able to link material back to theory. If it's not to the readings that I post, then to material that you find yourself. And again, there's a deadline around posting to the Milo discussion board. The third online exercise might be that you actually pull together a submission to the Hobart City Council about their private transport consultation. So that's going on at the moment. And if you are going to do that, post your response to the Milo discussion board. So it can be including, the formal salutations to council. You don't need to adapt it, just post to Milo what you're going to send Hobart City Council. If you're not making a submission or you're doing a region other than Hobart, then use these prompts for your third online exercise. So make some comment about how land use planning controls like zoning affect your region's ability to develop sustainable and people-centred transport systems. What can you find in terms of land use planning controls that says something about this? This might not be easy to find, but do have a look in the academic literature to see whether there's already been comment that does that hard work for you in terms of going back to the legislation and what it says. What do you think the prospects are for your region in terms of integrated transport? So what is either already there in planning but not there yet, or just not spoken about yet? So what might be actually missing from plans? And thinking about the advice that you might give your local council, whether it's Hobart or a different council, what do you think are the most important actions over the short, medium and long term that would make the transport system more efficient and more sustainable? So this all needs to be posted by that third deadline. So have a go at describing your region in the next lecture, which you will need to listen to before we go out for our field trip or before you go out for a trip around your region, is around sustainable transport planning and the principles that underlie sustainable transport planning, what a good strategic transport plan might look like, so that you can critique what's available for your region. And then the final lecture before the final posting, we'll be looking at data, actors, stakeholder, and how people are or aren't involved. In terms of references, here's the MEAS chapter that I've drawn on pretty heavily for this particular lecture from Planning Australia and a couple of others.